Welcome back, everyone, to our third and final panel. For those of you who've been here all day, thank you very much for sticking with us throughout the whole program so far. So this third panel is on Britain's role in the Indo-Pacific. And some might say, well, what role, right? Britain is very remote from this part of the world. But it's also true that there are important Commonwealth states in a sort of long arc all the way from Pakistan in the west to New Zealand in the far east of the region. And the UK certainly defines itself as having a critical role to play in multiple aspects of politics, trade, and social interaction in the Indo-Pacific. And so broadly speaking, we can talk about kind of security, trade, and ideas or values, principles, whatever we want to call them. And in some ways, that mirrors the structure even of the panels today, right? The first panel was largely about ideas and principles. The second more about trade. And this one is sort of generally about many things, indeed all three of those things. So we have two panelists today. First, we have to my right, Catherine West, who's the Labour MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, as well as the Shadow Minister of State for Asia and the Pacific. And then to my left, Doug Chalmers, who now is the Master of Emmanuel College and Chair of our Centre for Geopolitics Management Committee, but formerly had a 27-year, I believe? 37-year military career, and many, many roles in that. Notably for our purposes here as Lieutenant General of the British Army and Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff for Strategy and Operations. And so I'd like to invite both of them to talk about sort of those themes. What is Britain's interest in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to security, to trade, and to ideas and principles? And then also what might be the best course of action for realizing that interest, and how is that reflected in the current state of affairs or what might come later? So I'm not sure who should go first. Perhaps Catherine West, you go ahead first.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I'm always slightly in awe in these academic situations because, as many of you who watch Parliament TV will see, Parliament isn't really as polite as you've all been this afternoon, but I will try my best. It's a real pleasure also to be to such a beautiful college, and just a reminder of what a wonderful export knowledge, learning, education, and particularly this area of research, the Indo-Pacific area, is so important. And it does worry me that we're not attracting enough students, so it's lovely to see some slightly younger faces here. So that we can really deepen our understanding of the region. Bill, you've asked me to address security, trade and values, and obviously security doesn't just cover the hard power, which I think my colleague on the panel will cover quite well. It's also obviously around the earlier conversation many of you were having on the panel before about the chips industry, anything basically that has a military application or that provides a sort of a network of being so far ahead of us in the UK or the EU or the US or other countries. And I think certainly having sat on the Bill Committee for the Telecoms and Communication Security Bill, that went through completely unopposed. Obviously, my colleague Cheon Wura, who is the Shadow Minister for Science, did move some very useful amendments to tidy it up from a technology point of view. But really, there was no political disagreement. And I think really in Parliament, there is an across-the-board view that we do need to be much more thoughtful about engagement. And certainly, not just when we're talking about, say, a topic like Taiwan, which is obviously going to include lots of talk about, military hardware, etc. But just in general, a sense that, whether it's trade, whether it's certain ways that we are engaging on education and other things, that there is a sense of national security being paramount. Obviously, on the trade question, China is the UK's fourth largest trading partner, And that obviously means that we need to be, looking at and I guess in a sense auditing if there are any things which we feel or experts feel are not safe, but in general without completely wanting to shut down what is obviously a vital trading partnership. And that's really the idea of balance. And certainly I feel that it's very important that we still talk, that we engage, that we use some of the really excellent fora that we have. For example, the Foreign Office funds a group called the Great Britain China Centre. It's very important that their work is able to continue, that it's well supported by members of Parliament, that we have a broad base of knowledge within Parliament, both in the Commons and the Lords, so that the statements that we make in Parliament and the work that we do in bill committees is based on up-to-date information. On the question of values, obviously to pick out the most obvious examples, you'd all be aware of concerns of parliamentarians about what is happening to the Uyghur minority in the Xinjiang area, and obviously also the very strong relationship we have with Hong Kong and worries there about the national security legislation. We supported the government very strongly in withdrawing the judges from being involved, certainly on the national security piece, but in general, in terms of any sense that there was being complicit with youngsters being repressed brutally by the police and so on. So there are two examples. And in Parliament, there's also a very lively all-party group on Tibet, which talks about freedom of religion or belief. And so we have, we're covering, I think, most of the principles and most of the values. So that's just a very broad brush stroke, and I'm very aware that I'm here amongst experts. So please, with the questions, keep them broad. MPs are very much generalists. On the India and the Indo-Pacific sort of area, I would say that Keir Starmer today has been talking very much about doing much more on the trade piece, very behind the concept of the trade deal. Obviously, some of the way that the government has gone about the trade deal has been more performative than reality. That's my reading of it. But since then, I think things are deepening a little bit more now. And certainly, if you look at our allies, Australia, for example, when the Labor government came in there a year ago, it did more of a sort of a formal reset with the Chinese government around trade, but also has done quite a lot of certainly optics about getting closer to India as well. And I don't think that is just about, who do you choose, India or China, because nobody wants to go down that sort of pathway, but I think it's more about being open-minded about where there are synergies, where there are where are there things that we can do together in more detail. And just one example, of course, that we saw during COVID was the collaboration on with the Serum Institute, and that's a very obvious example, but something which I think I'd like to see the UK government being much more proactive on. I also chair the all-party group for neglected tropical diseases and malaria. And obviously Sarah Gilbert, who invented the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, her work was actually DFID-funded work that had been done in Brazil. And obviously then later on, as soon as the Serum Institute got hold of various elements of our research and development here, things were really able to take off. So I do hope that being in an academic environment, I can say, keep going, keep shouting at MPs that we're not pushing through more funding for research and development, because it's an incredibly important field. And obviously that's very much an area of cooperation, strong cooperation, with partners around the research and development, around science, around medical progress. And I think that's something which I would really like to see our own government getting on with more.
Great.
Thank you. I would first start off with the caveat that I've been out of the centre of sort of the security world in an informed way for nearly 2 years now. So some of what I'm saying now is more reflecting on times past and then drawing on some of the open source stuff that you've been able to sort of read since. And I think I was just really going to build on what I talked about that by both the speakers earlier on, is that Indo-Pacific is pretty self-evident important to us, UK, as a trading nation. And that word trading nation, obviously post-Brexit, has got a slightly different veneer on it than it probably did before Brexit. And that sometimes the description here is, I think, over geography rather than necessarily the issues that emanate from can dominate. What I mean by that is sometimes you hear articles about it's Euro-Atlantic or Indo-Pacific. And of course, it never has been either or, but it's the balance of what bit goes into what area. And the historical links that we've got there, the Commonwealth, which Bill's already mentioned before, stretches across their different levels of connection in there. And I think to build on something that's said earlier on, some of which there's new rhetoric or new agreements, but actually colouring in necessarily the definition of what those agreements might mean is stuff that will come to follow. But we shouldn't forget things like Pitcairn, still a dependent territory, Brunei, our connection with that, Diego Garcia, and then the Five Eyes relationship, which has been core and at the heart of our sort of security apparatus and alliance building work for the UK for a long time. And the IR, that was the first IR that sort of published, talked about the tilt to there. And it tried to talk about the language about, it tried to get that balance, that answer between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. And it's tried to, but some of the packaging that wrapped on sort of talked more about the tilt. And then, of course, we sent a carrier into the Pacific, which sort of dragged, I think, a lot of people's sort of engagement in that direction. And since then, of course, the Russians invaded Ukraine, and then I think the South China Sea, or the consciousness of some of the behaviour in the South China Sea, and indeed I would say the pressure around Taiwan has only escalated since. And that has changed. So the IR refresh, I think, has altered that. And the language now, I think, is much clearer. It's not yet described as a threat, and I pick these words carefully. China poses an epoch-defining challenge to the type of international order that we want to see, both in terms of security and values, building on the values bit before, individual freedoms probably sitting at the heart of that. So our approach must work. But it does keep open that, we need to work with China. There's the trade part that's worked in there, but there's also the simple reality that some of our climate change targets for us as a global community are impossible without working as a global community to get to that. But, and the refresh talks about this, is where the Chinese Communist Party are using attempts to coerce or to create dependencies, we'll work closely with others to push back against them. That is quite different language than we saw before that's inside of there. And we are taking new action to protect ourselves, our democracy and our economy at home. And you've seen some of that, particularly when it comes to IP and some of the dual-use technology transfers that are being talked about. The other bit that for me that picked up is the last time we didn't really talk about Taiwan. I don't think Taiwan was directly mentioned. This time it is, and it's the China's aggressive stance in the South China Sea and Taiwan is now there, as a quote. So that is a slight shift in the UK's perspective. But what are we doing about it? And this, I will sort of just list out stuff you would have seen before. We now have dialogue status with ASEAN, which I think is important. We've been after that for quite some time, actually, well into the early part of my time. We've just become members of the CTPP, which I think you're right. There's the colouring in the map beneath, but actually becoming part of that and having those conversations, some of which actually meant unlocking the negotiation with Canada over agriculture, which got us into the Pacific in a sort of a way, I think has set a slightly different platform than what we had before. The free trade agreement with Australia, the free trade agreement with Singapore, and then nested underneath that with Singapore is that digital economy agreement and the green economy framework that sits in there as well. Updating our free trade agreement with the Republic of Korea, investment into the Singapore hub, AUKUS and GCAP, which naturally is someone from the military side you would expect me to talk about. AUKUS obviously between Australia, UK, US, focused around conventionally armed nuclear submarines, and GCAP, the Global Combat Air Programme, particularly with Italy and Japan. Now, much of that is connecting relationships that were before. So the UK's relationship with Japan might feel new, but if you roll back 100 years, actually not completely sort of alien, as we've seen that before. And the Five Eyes bit I've talked about before. So those are all new dots on the map. Some are reinventing stuff that existed before. Some are adding in a new trellis, a new framework. But I would very much describe them at the moment as a framework. I don't think, as you mentioned earlier on, that the actual substance beneath them is not yet there. But being at those tables is very different than where we would have been 10 years ago, where we wouldn't have even been in the room, let alone at the table. So switching to my old life, what is our value on the security side? And I'm going to start with the bottom end, actually. It's pretty self-evident that in terms of the scale of the US and the Chinese military power and the growth of that military power inside of that we are a very, very, very small component. And trying to even come close to actually being relevant in the size of those conventional forces, I think is delusionary, if not actually impossible in that sort of way. On top of that, we've got our own, this is where we do have a Euro-Atlantic sort of part, and the new sort of NATO's new force model, which is coming to be, and our part to play into that, I think is an important part, which will focus, I think we wait to see what the Defence Command Paper refresh says, but I wouldn't be surprised if it says that. But when it does say that, don't forget that a capability that might be tagged to NATO under a NATO force model can move. And actually the carrier task group and the conventionally armed nuclear submarines that we have are classic examples of that. We can have that capability and tag it under a NATO bit so it's interoperable there, but it can also move, as it has done and was proven by the task force bit, to the other side of it. One of the ambitions about having a rotational nuclear submarine in Australia, for example, sort of indicates that might be side on the way to go to it. But that's not really where the UK will add its pace. Where can we add a little bit more to it? And I offer this as my thoughts to it. So if we're not going to be measured by our physical number of carrier strike groups and all the rest of it on that chessboard, where would we play our role? I think it's in a number of areas. So I think in tech innovation and advancing, I think that sort of integrator of some of those technological advances, that defence breakthrough type stuff, is there. And I think AUKUS and GCAP provide two good examples, actually, where I think the UK defence industry linking in with technology has a role to play. Those parties, and they're serious parties in those two organisations, wouldn't have engaged with it if they didn't think the UK had a role to play in there. I think there's stuff to be done in the virtual space. I mean, over the years, our sort of, whether it be NCSC to GCHQ sort of engagements through the Five Eyes network is not insignificant. And obviously that has a value to be added in what's a completely contested area before. And this goes back into it, when we say Indo-Pacific, we can't help but tag it into geography. And of course, the virtual world is global, and therefore what emanates from one breeds into the other. So I think there's work there that we can add value to. The UK relationship with the French through CGEF, I think, has had highs and lows over the time that's been forward. On the military level, it was actually fairly strong. It's the policy level and the politics level that go up and down. But there is a willingness in the Pacific where neither of us have enough of anything to try to collaborate a bit more in some of the areas through, at least in training, in putting a bit more onto it. The next one is, you'd expect me to say it, I suppose, but I think it is trying to work out what your strengths are and what they aren't. We do have this long list of relationships with these countries. And, Five Powers Defence Agreement. Does anyone know what that is? Okay, so a few nodding faces here do. So we've been exercising in Malaysia and Singapore through the Five Powers Defence Agreement for decades. And so there is a relationship there that is quietly done, likewise in Brunei and in other parts of the Pacific. And this is where I found that sometimes our size, we're small and we're not the huge conventional power in the Pacific, actually gives you a voice, but you're regarded as a capable military that's worked out how to use its size effectively and spend money wisely. I'll leave that open to debate, but that is a sort of a perception out there. And therefore, sort of smaller countries, to be able to talk to us and engage with us, they can talk to us in a way that they just can't talk to the Americans. The Americans overload their capacity. They can't sort of match it before. And that's a sort of, I would say, Defence Department type level, but then it goes down as well, down into the forces. So our ability to train and advise sort of small forces in that way, and between ourselves and Australia, for example, is there. And there was discussion before I sort of left my last life between us and the Australians how we could do more. Because initially, 5-10 years ago, the Australians would have been quite nervous about being in the area, but now there's more than enough work to go around, and how that work gets spread around to help partners that want help sort of move forward. And there's much talk, not all complimentary, about our 2 offshore patrol vessels that are working hard, carrying a lot of load actually inside of the Pacific, that area. That don't judge them as a carrier task group. That, like I've said already a couple of times, would be wrong. But in terms of offering presence, freedom of navigation, exercise, as well as providing a platform to provide sort of maritime capacity building training and advice, they do have real value to go through. So it's something, I think, in our size and our ability to do both maritime and land and joint force training, I think that does go through forward. And then we do have some niche capabilities that range, I've touched on some in the cyber world, but they range down then through our special forces, down towards the nuclear submarine aspect that I've talked about, that are unusual for a small country in a faraway land, where those niche elements might provide something else. So I'll just close off by saying I think there is these areas that we can do, but a bit like I talked about all the new platforms, those are all dots that we can bring into bear, but actually bringing them in a way that builds utility to the countries that are there, I think we're still some way from going that far. And that will take time. And the reason being, a lot of what I've talked about by nature of what we are is it is small amounts of things being done. And they will need to be done consistently to start to build a relationship that has duration over time. And I'll pause there.
Great. Let me just pose maybe one question on each of these 3 big themes and kind of direct it to some part of the region, to each of the panelists. And then after we've done with that discussion, we'll open it up to questions from the general audience. So on trade specifically, or on economic and trade relations, right? The UK has signed up to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. It's one of the only countries from outside the region to do that. The other thing that the UK has done has been to initiate this much closer relationship with ASEAN than it had held before. And so both of those are highlighted in the integrated review and indeed in the refresh, as I think has already been mentioned. And they're also things that have been accomplished, so to speak, by the current government. Is that a good idea? Is that actually the best way to achieve trade goals? What was the reason for doing that, and what results will that bring? And is there something else that maybe the UK should be doing in terms of trade or economic relations, particularly in Southeast Asia, but actually right across the region, that could bring better results? And what are the kind of structural constraints around trade? To what degree can the UK be a major trading power in that part of the world, or should it try to be?
I mean, I'll have a go kicking off with that one. Clearly, the Labour Party is not allergic to Europe or anything that's got the letters EU in it. So I think from a sort of a mindset point of view, we will be wanting to fix some of the trade issues with Europe, obviously, which are non-political and non-contentious. They're details which just need to be ironed out. And so I think that will be obviously something which we would work towards. And both David Lammy, Keir Starmer, Nick Thomas-Symonds have all set out those sorts of things around, frictionless trade, around the Northern Ireland Protocol, working towards making life easier for both our exporters and our importers. If you speak to people, for example, who are in, fashion in the UK, it used to be just overnight to get a whole set of zippers and buttons, and now you have to wait months and you can't get them, and your people purchasing them have to, and all the rest of it. So I think there's a few things that are completely not political or about rejoining the European Union, which I think we will be able to do quite easily. And the second thing to say is, of course, the fastest growing region for trade and so on, is the emerging ASEAN, China, very large economy and therefore to be worked with very carefully. I mean, I know Ben was talking about Indonesia before, clearly country of 200 million people, and a lot of that work has started. So I've met the new Speaker of the Indonesian Parliament, who's been in to meet our Speaker. There's quite a lot of that is ongoing, but if you look at our balance of payments, it's not where it should be. And obviously in the local elections, the cost of living crisis and so on, like politically, our economy is not doing very well. So I think we do need to do both. We need to be completely pragmatic about fixing some of the things that are really easy to fix about our traditional, and what do they call it, gravitational pull or whatever, with European partners. But obviously there is a really exciting future to work closely with the Indo-Pacific area. ASEAN, I think I really welcome CPTPP, I welcome the positioning on AUKUS, but I also think that realistically speaking, we have to do both at the same time, because we haven't got 100 years to let our economy improve. We have to do it now, otherwise we're going to be struggling, and our constituents will be struggling for a very long time to come. So I would be saying we need to do both. We need to be pragmatic. And what I would like to see is, within our Whitehall, a greater understanding of the region, because over the years there have been a lot of cutbacks to the FCDO in that area. And even though we've had the IR, which has talked about the Indo-Pacific tilt, if you actually look at the number of ministerial visits and you look at the numbers of actual human beings who are looking after that region, it's not as great as it was. And I always interpret Indo-Pacific quite broadly. So, for example, I'm actually very worried about Pakistan right now, just in terms of the numbers of newspaper articles is coming up the agenda and so on. And I think from a security point of view, that's obviously something which, we have to always be mindful of, because a large country like that, if there are problems that end up spilling over into other neighbouring countries, that could be difficult. So, we have a number of challenges, and we have to somehow keep all of those in balance. But we also need to be quite sort of selfish on the trade thing. And if something is easier to do with trading partners that are closer, then we should quickly do it. Whereas I think this is more the strategic challenge with the growing part of the world that we need to engage with, and somehow manage to do both.
Did you want to add anything on trade?
Just a little bit, really, on two parts. One thing, it's another example of, it's not an either-or scenario. I think it has to be a bit of both, and historically it always was a bit of both. I mean, like I say, go back 150 years, you ask a person on the street where the Malacca streets were, you'd probably get more answers that were correct than you would do if you asked that question today. So I think there is that aspect to it, and it is an economic powerhouse to do it, which that's self-evident. Whether these are the right vehicles to do so, which I think was underpinning your question, I think we will see, because it'll be a two-way trade, and who benefits from some of these agreements over time, I think any trend analysis will go into it. I think the subset I would go on the trade, and if I can build on something that was said here, is our understanding sometimes we sometimes look at this, we get slightly, and I know I was guilty of it myself here, talking about a lot of China type language that comes out of the IR refresh. But actually our strength, which I mentioned, is our ability to listen and help, because of our size with some of the smaller countries that are trying to live in the region and balance between the US and the China as they navigate their own way through. And I think we need to understand that, because we all know and discuss about the Chinese claims, territorial claims, but there are a lot of other territorial claims that go on. If we are not slightly more attuned to the local scenarios, we could actually lose some of those relationships and actually push people in directions we may not do, just by not understanding what matters deeply to them, because we've got swept up into the macro narrative rather than taking time to understand the micro.
That's actually a really good segue into the question I was about to ask about security. Which is that if China is the epoch-defining and systemic challenge that the Integrated Review Refresh says it is, what's really the best way to counter that? And is that even something that has to be countered by the UK? Right? after all, a rather remote threat geographically, if there is a threat, or challenge geographically, if it is indeed a challenge, and the capabilities are limited. I think you've already hinted at one answer, which is work with smaller powers in the region to help them navigate different things. I'd love to talk more actually about the South China Sea, or the North Natuna Sea, as some of those other claimants would call it. And in fact, the cross-cutting claims of not just Vietnam and Malaysia, but also the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as China. But abstracting out from that just a bit, what is really the role of the UK then in countering that security challenge? Is it really mostly about cooperation with certain powers? Is AUKUS and the Global Combat Air Program and some of these other is that really sufficient? Is there something else that could be done? What's the best way to kind of navigate that set of issues?
You go first.
I was going to say, it's probably my turn to take
You're a
point.
security
So,
expert.
yeah, it's probably my turn. I think, and you're right, this is a tussle. I think this is where the refresh, I think, sat, and I would say, not that long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was pretty balanced. In fact, you go back further, I'd say the UK narrative towards China, it was very in fact, dramatically different, actually, from what we're seeing inside the paper. The golden opportunity and all the other sorts of it. I think it's the approach to individual freedoms and their view of community trumps individuals and other things like that, which goes against some of our sort of core values that we are trying to go to here. That is a global challenge, and the sort of the connections we see with some of the other countries that might view that in the same way, which are closer to us, and I'm particularly picking on there with the relationship towards Russia, but I wouldn't stop there. I'd say there's an Iran aspect probably in there as well to sort of add into it. All of those, I think, bring it into it. Then there is the virtual space we talked about before. There is the advance of some of the technologies, and particularly as we move into sort of AI and the rest of it, where there may not be the same level of ethical scrutiny or safeguards about using some of those tools, because their output is to, look after the majority and accept the collateral of the individual in that journey, which is a very different approach to us. And once these things are created, they will transition and trade across the piece before. And of course, we are. You mentioned on the island chains, etc. There now. Well, we have partners with historical relationships who, their claims sort of fall on the wrong side of some of those lines as well. And are we just a fair weather friend, or the historical relationship we've got? Therefore, part of it is diplomatic advocacy and support, which a lot of what we do. And don't forget the military, even the government's bit, we are the last line. There's the sort of the diplomatic, economic and development lines are way ahead of the military tool in terms of how we all get after UK interests. But I would also point to the future in that, don't forget that northern passage over the top of Russia is sadly melting. Or it's thawing, which means that passage will change, and therefore some of those trade routes which seem very distant now, we get sometimes beguiled because we keep on looking at the Mercator of the map that still has a UK in the centre of it. But if you look at it actually from a different angle, you can suddenly see it may not actually be as far away as you think when some of those changes take place. What can we do about it? And that's why I say, repeat, is I don't think what we can do is it would be rhetoric that is impossible to back up to try and say we're going to become, we're going to offer X number of carrier strike groups in there, particularly when we have the sort of the North Atlantic close, intimate security to it. But I wouldn't rule out the fact that stuff can move, but don't be that the guide. I think where we will add our part, like I say, is in some of the other niche areas and in more of an integrator role, as I've talked about. AUKUS and GCAP being examples more about tech development than they are about combat capability. Other stuff will come.
Perhaps I could introduce a different theme, and I'm sure there's expertise in the room on this, and that is the influencing role, and thinking very much about traditional friends in Africa, and obviously we would like, as the Labour Party, to move towards the 0.7% commitment again. And of course, a lot of that is a development spend, but a lot of that is also tied in with our more strategic aims. And I think we've seen in Latin America and in Africa where one walks away, other friends will come into those spaces, and I think it's about trying to look at what we are saying and how we are working in those other areas, and not just the poverty reduction, which is incredibly important, but also thinking about climate, thinking about people movement, and thinking about health security. Now, all of those are very complex themes with lots of PhDs in them, I'm sure, but I think it's just trying to widen our view, and also working with partners that we have very much, great friends on the continent of Africa, and trying to work with them to develop not just more equality and more of a developed sense of health security, but also obviously ensuring that the funding that we have for climate change is something which is actually helping economic development in China, in Africa as well. And I'm sure that the US would be saying the same thing about Latin America, and I know with the Labor government in Australia, which is nearly a year old or about a year old, is very much reconnecting with Pacific partners. And I think that's just something which we shouldn't forget when we're talking about our own strategy, but looking at that holistically so that there is more of a sense of influencing and building up relationships and refreshing old friendships.
Great. One last question from me is actually more on the issue of values and ideas. If we think about sort of balancing these three strands of foreign policy or international relations of sort of security, trade, and values, it's not always easy to do so, right? One often has to make compromises in one area to achieve gains in the other two, or perhaps not. And so this comes up specifically in the context of if expanding trade links in Southeast Asia and throughout the region really is important, and in particular with India and signing a free trade agreement there, or looking, I think it has been signed actually, the free trade agreement, and sort of moving ahead with more and more trade in India, as well as using India and other powers and sort of long-standing relationships with some of those to balance the security challenge coming from China. What about values in that, right? If values are in fact to protect vulnerable populations like the Uyghurs who've come up, or people in Hong Kong, or to protect those who might be sort of run over by larger powers like Taiwan, or also to protect democracy and individual rights, liberalism sort of writ large, a country like India is becoming increasingly illiberal in many ways. And so is it not in some ways a difficult balancing act to advance that sort of values agenda and goals with regard to India while also expanding trade there and using it as a security balance against China?
Well, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Now we can all go off and have. I think the important thing is also, and there's diplomats in the room, it is that process, because obviously within a trade deal you should be having, in a perfect world, the chapter on human rights or values, and I think it is very important to have that as part of a chapter of a trade deal, and I think that is very much what we have excellent diplomatic people in the Foreign Office to do for us, but also for ministers to talk about as well. And I know that, if you look at Indonesia, for example, we do talk about West Papua if we're having a broad discussion on a number of trade questions, or if we want to talk about palm oil or some of the climate challenges. These are all things which are incredibly important. Just look at the big case against Exxon in Indonesia in the last month or so. That is a very expensive mistake of Exxon to have made several years ago now, but I think all of those things which do have an impact on people living in an area and have a very strong trade element to them as well. It is very important that we somehow make more progress than, say, just a very mercantilist view from 150 years ago or something. I don't know if anyone's been to see the British Museum's Hidden China exhibition, but I can really recommend it. I went to the opening the other night, but we do have to try and move beyond just a very transactional thing. which brings me back to my original point, which is how important you all are, because it's so important to have the depth of understanding, the relationships, and also to be having our expertise in China, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of the areas which I cover in the House of Commons. But in general, just to make sure that we don't cut back so much on our foreign policy approach and our diplomatic strengths for whatever reason, because in the end, those conversations, those processes are going to be how we do try and influence and shape the leaderships of countries where perhaps it is very, very different from our liberal democracy, but I think we can have an influence, and those conversations are really crucial.
All I'm going to say is that I think yes, it is very difficult, and it always has been, and that balancing act I think is tricky. And very much as mentioned, I think it is. That's why diplomacy sits at the number one of our tools that are declared by the government to do it. And all these platforms provide some of those vehicles for those tools to be brought to bear. But I would foot stomp again that but deepening the understanding in order to understand the nuances that when you sit here and you look into the region, you may not understand the tensions that go on at the smaller and more local level. I think that is something that that places like Cambridge can bring to. And it is one of the missions, dare I say it, Bill, of the Centre for Geopolitics, to try and help deepen some of the research into tensions that are known locally and really understood, but necessarily may not get the light here. Yeah. And then if we know them, then we can have these balancing conversations more effectively. If we just lecture, they don't go well.
Good points all. And so at this point, I think it'd be good to open up to questions. I've seen one hand over here, one over here, two, so three, so there are many. So maybe we'll take a bank of questions first. So Taka, if you want to start over here.
Thank you. My name is Brian Trim. I'm one of the Royal Navy's Mountbatten Fellows here at Cambridge for the year. Thank you both for your comments, really insightful and interesting. I'd like to pick up on a word that you've both used a great deal, and sir, you've touched on in your sort of final comments there about understanding. I will, if I may, just start with an anecdote. In my last job in the Navy's operational headquarters, I was responsible for the North Atlantic, and I had a team of people around me to conduct operations there. The rest of the world was covered by Staff Officer Rest of World. Now, my predecessor in this role at the university went off and was Staff Officer Indo-Pacific. He spent 2 years there and then moved on to some other job. How are we going to build that understanding beyond what we're doing here today to get it out of what is, frankly, a niche sport and actually build up some meaningful corporate knowledge and understanding? Because, as you say, if you ask the general informed layperson on the street where the Malacca Strait is, it's just not understood. It's a vast region, terribly complex. I'm not sure that we're fielding an A team. So thoughts welcome.
Okay, Bill, if I go ahead. Thanks very much, and thank you for your terrific questions as well, Bill. That's very helpful. I wanted to ask a question specifically to Doug Chalmers about AUKUS, because to increase my understanding of this policy, I mean, it seems to me that AUKUS cuts across a number of the other things that you described to the UK as trying to do in the region. It's not a policy that's particularly appreciated in the region. It's seen as polarizing, essentially. It cuts across the idea that these countries want to try to balance in some way the relationship between the United States and China. And I wondered if you actually yourself support it and would have advised against it, particularly since you described the UK as a security actor as a pretty small portion of that security challenge in the region. So what do you think of it? Thanks.
Take one or two more questions and then give everyone a chance to answer.
Hi, thank you. My name is Wilson. I'm from Singapore. I would like to build on Bill's questions about ASEAN. In both of your prepared remarks about the Indo-Pacific, there was not too much mention about it. So I'd like to ask your opinions on the credibility of ASEAN as an organization and your opinions on the concept of ASEAN centrality as espoused by ASEAN.
Maybe one last one before.
Thank you. Moaz Hyde. I'm a PhD student here with the Center for Geopolitics. My question is, I mean, we've seen a lot with, dialogues like this, Indo-Pacific strategy. There's, the UK is doing a lot of the right things. It's saying a lot of the right messages now. But is there actually an attempt to implement these policies? So now it's joined CPTPP. Now it's part of the ASEAN Dialogue Forum. But can it actually go beyond that? Instead of just looking at trade, but how do we invest outside of Singapore? How do we engage with Malaysia, for example, invest in Brunei, for example, invest in Indonesia? How do we realign those incentives to make those partnerships actually work? Because I think the real issue in the region right now is people are excited to see the UK is interested, but it's not clear that they're actually willing to follow up with policies to make that happen. So, thank you.
Great. Let's give our panelists a chance to respond before taking more questions. So, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Bill. Do you want me to do them all, or can I choose the ones?
You can pick and choose if you wish.
I wanted to pick up Rosemary's point about AUKUS. Obviously, you can tell I'm not an extra from Neighbours. I grew up in Sydney in Australia. Did come here many years ago, but speak with a very strong Australian accent. So I'm picking that one because I've looked into it a little bit. And obviously, it is, like the positioning is good, but there are a lot of question marks about what it will mean in practice. And I think until we sort of know a little bit more about, the budget lines and what's going to be in them. But I would hope that there would be sort of what we've been talking about today, given that in this room we have quite a lot of the world's experts on this, so that we get something that's much more rounded, that is about deepening understanding, that isn't just about hardware, that there is bits that are also looking at knowledge bases, how we work with what's happening in the region on, the influencing side of things, the development side of things, economic development in the Pacific, economic development in all those, all the ASEAN countries, how we manage to have as much flow of information, the scholarships, the people, trying to think, the influencing the future leaders. So we know that UK universities, for example, have educated 57 of the current prime ministers in the world. It's all those bits that I think have to go with it in order to understand how it could meet its full potential. And so I hope that when it starts being fleshed out, and Parliament should have much more scrutiny on this, and I should know exactly what's been announced since. I have met the Premier of South Australia, where the bit is going to be based in Australia, and obviously John Healey, who's the Shadow Defence Minister, and I have talked about the implications for Barrow in Furness in the UK, but it is still very sketchy in terms of the detail. The second question that I was keen to answer was just the implementation phase. And I think that's a really key question from a colleague here about what does it look like once this is implemented. And I think a proper strategy always relies on partners. So it wouldn't necessarily just be the UK doing a lot of the actions. It would be trying to work with partners. And the credibility and centrality of ASEAN in general, I think, I think traditionally being quite a relatively new forum. I remember when it was established. I think it could be even more sort of powerful than what it is right now. And so I would hope that, it will be able to define itself so that, countries like the UK can engage in a more meaningful way. Because I think sometimes some of those dialogues are not as developed as what they could be. Sometimes it's a little bit in Parliament when I hear that a minister's been to an ASEAN-related activity, when I sort of scratch under the surface, I can't feel that the implementation phase is coming back at me. So whoever said that about implementation is correct. The only thing I would say, and it's easy to say this in opposition, isn't it, as an opposition MP, but there's quite a lot of domestic policy areas where it's a bit like government by press release. So I would hope that if we do go forward and we do have, a fair wind behind us as a new government, I hope that things would be more fleshed out, and there would be proper programs which are attached to concepts, and that there would be more of a sense. The other big factor, of course, is what's going to happen in the US with the election. If it's continuity, then I think it'll be building on what the Biden presidency has done in the last 3 years. If it's change again, then we don't know what sort of phase we'll move into. So I think keeping all those balls in the air and knowing as well that we are in a kind of a saying a lot, talking a lot year because of the US election. And so in terms of implementation, in terms of how we deepen the understanding and so on, we may have to wait for it just even a little bit longer.
So I'll sort of, I think, if I may, I'll sort of take on the implementation one first, which I'll sweep in a bit of ASEAN too, then turn to understanding, which I think underpins it, and talk to AUKUS bit last. So I think on the, and I mentioned it a bit in here, I see all the initiatives that are laid out. And the thing that, when I was looking at this in a past life, is that in Europe, or in the Euro-Atlantic area, there is NATO and there are other sort of blocks. It's much clearer and easier to understand. And there are agreements that are made, and there's a thing called Article 5, and there's things when sovereignty is agreed together. It's very clear. There is no such thing in the Pacific. There are a range of different bodies that have different weight and different import that have changed over time. And ASEAN is one of those, actually, that sort of has cycled up and down depending on over time has gone on. And therefore, the answer to that, which I can understand why we've ended up in these, is therefore you've got to be kind of as many of these tables as possible in order to build relationships to it. The problem with that, I think, is twofold. Is at those tables, we are fairly new at them, and we need to build partners at those tables in order that we can work more collectively together. And I do think, and actually this has been, and what I've described to you there, and I think it was the fault of the first IR, and it still remains in the second IR, is we talk a lot about allies and partners, which is true, but it's inferred often that they will do our bidding, whereas in truth, we're only going to have a general partner if we have actually developed a true partnership with them. And like many of the trade bit, there is, and I'm being slightly simplistic, there's an expectation we'll get lots of trade from them to us on our benefit. Whereas actually what they want is access to our trade in order that they can make it. So when people don't enter these things into to give something away, and I'm not quite sure whether we have properly understood how we're going to build this partnership, which has long-term strategic gain. But to be honest, we're probably going to have to invest in it pretty upfront. Diplomatic support with their local issues, which I've talked about before, of which there are legion inside the Pacific area. Investment into them, development into them. Never compete with some of the Chinese stuff, but there are niche areas we might be able to do. There's advice and there's tech integration. There are other areas we might be able to do. But to get a partnership, we're going to have to, I think, lean in a bit further in terms of building partners in that way. Listen, I did a thing on the theories of cooperation a long time ago, and the ability and a prisoner's dilemma and all the rest of it sort of gets out of that. But that will matter here, and our value at the moment of being a reliable long-term strategic partner is not exactly great. So there's a bit of which we can be a bit flaky here. And therefore some of these countries who are living in the region and under pressure from violent neighbours next door are going to balance their existential threat to their sovereignty and the protection of their citizens against being nice to us. So we've got to listen, we've got to add some value into the challenges that they're facing, and we've got to be in for the long haul. This is a duration type of affair. And in terms of are we doing the right thing, and therefore the understanding bit is long, and that's a bit, and we haven't quite made that journey yet. Long time ago, because sailing distance was long, people went a long time, and then they came back. It's that sort of time to specialise in an area and get to understand it. We're starting it, but it's pretty small in terms of it. And actually having the forward-based OPVs is a little nibble in the right direction, but there is more to do it with desk officers, training, number of people on the intelligence desks, all of that other bit will sort of help. But it will take time to layer up that experience. It's fairly new, if you think about it, because you're right, the ROW desk was over a lot of patches. We go on to it. Links then, if I may, onto AUKUS. So AUKUS itself is, as I mentioned, it's a good old-fashioned game of battleships where there is a conventional problem growing, of which a conventionally armed nuclear submarine is a good advantage to it. And the countries that do conventionally armed nuclear submarines are the US and the UK, and Australia in terms of balance, and the Five-Power Defence Agreement, not Five-Power, so the Five Eyes Agreement allows us to share some of those technologies to go forward. But it has become polarising. But the point you make about it being polarising is right. The one I also wrote, we didn't talk about so far, is we're a founding member of a thing called the Blue Pacific Initiative. That feels very odd to me, because it's a group of outsiders effectively trying to tell some of the locals how to do it. It's got a long way to go before it builds any trust, I think, with some of those nations. So there is a danger, a real risk, I think, like I say, we don't invest in understanding what our local, the people we want to be partners, this very rich tapestry of small elements, some huge, some small, but all involved in the area, over a massive area, have all got slightly different pressures and issues that they need to resolve. And there's a danger sometimes sitting this far away, we put it all on a small map and we start to think they all think the same thing. And they don't. And the Blue Pacific Initiative is one of those ones that sort of really worries me a bit, actually, because it's easy to suddenly cluster everything up. And around the founding members of the Blue Pacific Initiative, there aren't many nations that are in the Blue Pacific. Observation.
Great. Now, for this round of questions, I'll just ask that because Doug Chalmers actually has to leave a bit earlier than the official end of the panel because of another engagement, if you have questions specifically for him, please let's prioritize those. But then also, I'll give him a chance to answer first in the next round, just in case we're running up against that clock.
Thank you very much for some very interesting comments. If I may, so I do have a question for Doug, which hopefully Catherine West can also respond to. In your presentation, you talked about the idea that, okay, the UK is a bit small in the region, and that with the long-term kind of diplomatic relations that we've had, there's scope for really working together in a stable manner. But as was also raised, is that AUKUS does raise some people's shoulders or backs about, and so there's a bit of a tension there. And I was wondering if you could speak to that tension in terms of, while we may be small and we may be able to bring, like we promote our aid in the region, which we have a long kind of tradition for that, but that tension with regard to AUKUS becomes quite problematic in terms of undermining our position at the same time, particularly with the integrated refresh if we're trying to promote a form of multilateralism and stuff like that, like with the G20 or even ASEAN. And then my final point was, I'd like to know your take on the idea of, that's been floated, Asian NATO.
I should just add, Tucker, I've just been told Doug actually can stay until 5, so we no longer have to tier the questions in that way. So any questions at all are fair game.
So I think it was interesting how you mentioned how Britain is so far geographically from the Indo-Pacific region, but I think it would be quite interesting to know how much financial capital Britain has deployed there, because I think that's a real answer as to why. And just to answer one of your points, we had to get dialogue partner with ASEAN because prior to that we were part of the EU and it was a block-to-block relationship. So I don't think it was an initiative on our part. We just had to do it. So a question is, I can't see any other European power willing to project power into the Indo-Pacific apart from ourselves. I think the Anglosphere, yes, and then it's limited. I don't think Canada and New Zealand are keen to do that.
France.
Sorry. Well, okay, well, that's interesting, but I'll let you answer. But then does that matter, or is it the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, they all have navies, Japan, that can be deployed. So maybe it doesn't matter that Europe's not so involved. And then my final point, sorry if I've hogged the microphone, I think most parliamentarians can blag or bluster their way through a talk on American, French culture, maybe even German or Russian, but I think they draw a blank when it comes to Indo-Pacific cultures, the history. So when are parliamentarians going to get up to speed, seeing as our foreign policy has a definitive Indo-Pacific tilt? Thank you.
Hi, it's a question for Doug. I was wondering from your MOD experience, whether you could reflect on the importance of having commercial contracts in the region. You mentioned GCAP, and AUKUS is obviously a commercial contract. Maybe even South Korean aircraft carriers might become a joint project. And how the feedback works between deployment and interest and commercial return, and how that works internally inside government as an incentive.
Let's take one more and then we'll go to answers. Maybe over here.
Hi, General. This is initially what you said about GCAP, and also, Bill, hopefully you can add some geopolitics to this. The foreign military sales, the American model for selling defense equipment overseas is very restrictive. And my understanding of GCAP is that the Japanese are interested in it because it potentially unlocks that restriction by operating with European partners. Is there not a risk, and this is not my position, but it's more of a question, is there not a risk that allowing that sort of development within the region potentially offers us a move towards an arms race by enabling regional partners to develop capability in a way that American model has potentially held them back in the past?
Okay, I think we should probably allow for answering now. I'll answer a couple of them first, one or two that were directed sort of more to me. On the ASEAN-EU issue, that's a good point. But I also don't think it was absolutely structurally constrained. It's something that could have been relatively deprioritized or given a higher priority. And I think it was given a higher priority than was absolutely necessary in that state of affairs. So I do think it was something that was set as an explicit goal for a reason beyond just restoring the contact that was there. There's plenty of individual states that have easy contact with ASEAN, and it would have been relatively easy to do that at a lower level than was in fact prioritized and achieved. So I think it's still significant in a certain way. In terms of the capital investment, yes, absolutely. Not just capital investment, but more so I actually think something else that we haven't really talked about much on today's panel, though we've alluded to it, I think all three of us, and that is also not really prioritized in the integrated review from what I can recall, which is the soft power of institutions and ideas. And in that sense, the UK sort of punches well above its weight. If we look at financial rules, for example, and banking institutions, not banks themselves as physical institutions, but institutions in the way that banks do business with one another across borders, the UK has a great deal of influence over that, and has since there has been modern banking. And that affects all the countries in the region in very significant ways. Similarly, things like media, publishing, journalism, academic discourse, even occasionally at the real margins, can have an influence, can have sometimes significant influence, and a great deal of that space is occupied by English. I think it's easy to forget that, sitting in an English-speaking country, speaking English, that English has a kind of global hegemony in many ways in those areas of discourse, and a lot of that content is produced or mediated through the UK or in the UK. So in that sense, there's a great deal of potential power in the region, not least also because English is a widely used international language specifically in this region, even more so than in some other regions of the world. So in that sense, that's quite important. In terms of the arms race question, yes, I think there is perhaps a greater risk of an arms race, but I think those who have advocated in the US sort of political landscape for relaxation of some of those rules have generally started from the point of saying an arms race is already occurring. So it's not that we're going to cause an arms race, so there's an arms race that's already underway, and we need to make sure to assist the states on the quote-unquote right side or our side of that arms race. Whether that's a correct assumption or a correct starting point is an open question on which I don't really have a good answer. There's a significant political debate about that in the US and in other countries. But I think the supposition is that it's already there. So let me give the other two panelists a chance to answer.
Maybe if I could just come in with, and I'm sure you've already talked about this earlier today before I arrived, but obviously Ukraine has been a bit of a game changer in that a lot of those partnerships, relationships, networks that we're talking about now were suddenly put to the test. Now, obviously, we can talk about efficiency, efficacy, but I think in terms of the actual joining together and sticking together, on the whole, the partners have done that, which I think not everybody would have guessed, February 2022. So I think that is something to do with the fact that we have worked in these sorts of fields for all those years, not just through NATO, but through the EU, through just, the leaderships knowing each other, and I think that's a real positive. In terms of just picking up the point about the arms race, I mean, I always felt during the period of 18 to 22 when President Trump was in that, like, just even from a body language point of view, he's in the trenches. Now, whether that was when it all started or whether it was 2018 when Xi Jinping achieved his core leader status, it's neither here nor there. In terms of the way that we look at these things over a century, it's around the same period. And I think the sort of combination, and it's more honest to talk about the fact that there is now a kind of a sense of, what do we do to prevent things getting too hot war-ish, and that's what's I think that's why it's so important to have these events, because we can think those things through. If I could also just mention on the institutions, obviously, the UK has got very significant footprint in, or the UK firms in Hong Kong, for example, and that's Shanghai and so on, and that's actually why a lot of this really, really matters for the UK, because that is, our economy is very much based on a lot of those financial institutions. So from a risk point of view, trying to get it right so that it's as positive a business environment as possible is really important. And that's why it's a real pity that some of the judges from Hong Kong have had to withdraw, because what you want is, and there were moves to build that up, that, the rule of law, introducing the rule of law to sort of try and regularise a lot of the way that financial institutions worked. And I think it's a pity that we seem to be going back from that. I think we had to. I don't think there was a choice, but it does worry me because obviously, within the way of doing business in China, there is the committee that is the CCP committee that sits on, and it's very, very influential in businesses, and that is really not genuine capitalism as we would know it. And there's all sorts of complex questions that we can get into. So if I could just pick up one point just to answer the MP peers question. MPs and peers are not taking enough interest in this area. And just to give you one example, when Bill came to do a House of Commons library talk, he was on the panel. Were you there as well, Winnie? And there was a third who you will remember. Yes, Cindy Yu, and three very high-profile, exceptionally fantastic speakers. And guess how many MPs and peers came? 3. And when you think, for an academic to give up a whole day to come to Parliament, to have an in-person meeting, deeply disappointing, but sadly not uncommon. James King did a bit better from the FT. He got sort of maybe 12, but it's a big problem. Yeah.
Ukraine did it. That was the day that Poland had the missile sent in.
Absolutely, and it's always the day that this happened or the day that that happened. But what we're trying to talk about is, you know, the strategic thing that we need to get ourselves better educated. And, you know, the House of Commons Library puts on fantastic events, and they're trying to do another one, and I'm thinking, please do, but don't just invite me. You know, I consider myself a babe in the woods. I've got a Chinese master's from SOAS, but I am by no means an expert. But if I'm the one in the room, I think it's the others who also need to be in there. And I'm sure you find the same thing in defence, that it's really, really hard because you're just very pressed on sitting days because there's lobbies in and there's legislation and people who are in select committees and yes, but we definitely need to redouble our efforts to educate ourselves. But we also have very good civil servants so that when we're actually in government, they can advise as well.
I want to build on those two things first. So I think the understanding and learning is hard, and for the reason you just talked about there. But also I think, and it's something I began to think of before, say that there's so much social media, the Netflix factor and all the rest of it, that I think some people's subconscious understanding is based on those, because they may not have read the brief and they may not have invested the time in doing it. And it was not part of their core education when they were growing up. And so they've been influenced by things before. And time is short, and the chance to actually read the brief and understand it, I think, is a challenge. I hadn't really until Ben mentioned it. I hadn't really thought about the English bit, which I think is something we should do. And actually, I do worry a little bit about some of the Home Office bits on international students, for example, coming into the UK and how that will affect. Because actually, that sort of transfer of them understanding us now, there's enough polling to say that quite a few come here, see our society, go back, not interested in our society. But at least there are some connections made, human connections made over time. But we'll see where that one goes in the future. But it's a worry thing. If we pull up a drawbridge and we don't connect, the generation or the generation after next is going to be something more remote. And then you rely more on the Netflix factor, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. Answering the question sort of put through before, I think if I did this sort of the arms race bit, I was, as Bill was speaking, he's ate every sandwich. I was going to respond to that one. I think there's a heavy group that would say there is already an arms race, and China is ahead in terms of building the capacity, the capability, the skills, etc. within it. There was a real debate, which I think Ukraine has really moved about through it. And I would say that the F-16's decision by the States recently has is a next layer in that decision-making before. But the GCAP bit, to think the GCAP thing would not be woven into conversations with through the US mechanism, I don't see that happening. So there's a tension. But it does feel to me that the bar has been shifted in that side of it. In terms of the commercial contracts to deployments bit, I never got my head around this, but I wouldn't, because I was the ops guy, therefore wanted people to be deployed to do ops. There's another part of defence that wanted people to be deployed to sell an advanced trade, and there's a sweet spot between the two. But it is that trade-off, which Bill rightly posed as a question earlier on, between values and trade, and therefore for me, security, interest, and effect, vice port calls to sort of advance there. It's a trade. It's a trade-off, but the two are not unconnected. So if we want to improve a nation's capabilities in a certain area, because that way we don't have to deploy our capability, they can use their capability, which is, simplistic version of it, but not the wrong version of it. And if we can then sell them that capability, then there's a sort of a mutual element to go through. On the European nations one, and AUKUS, actually, there is an interlink here, because the other nation, which I spent a lot of time talking about specifically, who did have, but a different map, is France. So France they have far more dependent territories in the Pacific than we do, and their connection and responsibility for those island chains, they take still quite seriously, actually. And they are more regular in deployment terms into the area because of that reason than we are. And there was talk of a collaboration between us on freedom of navigation things and some other bits that went through. AUKUS damaged that, self-evidently, because we knocked out a deal that had been done with France before. That will be rebuilt over time, I think, but it will take some time to do it. But the other European deployer with a Pacific interest, I would put, is France, very highly on there, to a greater ratio than us right now. The Navy might contest that statement, but I think it depends how we count OPV hours, I suppose. The other one, which was about on AUKUS again, it is a tech collaboration thing. My worry is and there is an inference that this will go into rotational submarine patrol profiles, etc., and that will change that diagram, I think, that field quite a lot. The other one, which was about the idea of an ASEAN-NATO, I've heard it discussed, I've heard it mentioned, except no one ever understands how we'd ever get to it, because, dare I say it, the situation after the end of the Second World War was slightly clearer. There was literally an iron thing, and there was one side and another side, and it was pretty clear. The clarity is just not there in there, and to build the consensus now, when many people are trying to navigate how they swim between these two great powers, the clarity that was present that enabled NATO to be born, I don't think is present right now.
Great. Take a couple more. Tuck.
My name is Ken from Taiwan, and today we haven't discussed about Japan, and I think Japan is a very important regional country, and actually the UK just signed an RAA, it's an agreement, reciprocal access agreement for military personnel. So my question is, what is the implications of the potential UK-Japan partnership, implications to Taiwan or other regional countries? And the other question is, General said, if you compare the numbers, armed force, fighter jets or warships, the numbers, UK might be much smaller than China and the US, but you have BAE systems and actually technology and capability is there. So in which way we can use it as a leverage for the regional security and peace?
Thanks. We've all been in furious agreement that we want sort of more MPs, businesses, members of the public to care about this part of the world. And obviously, that sort of promotional and research activity costs money. So my question is for Catherine about money. How might you persuade Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership that in the next manifesto, it would actually be worthwhile and important to set aside a serious amount of money to promote knowledge of and engagement with the Indo-Pacific, not necessarily just for government, but for whole of society?
Great. Maybe one more question.
So the UK has had a long commitment to North Korea, and on a panel with security as a focus, I find it astonishing that we've got to this point without mentioning it.
Fair. Yeah.
It's one of the biggest potential security risks in the region. Our ambassador hasn't been in the embassy since he left during COVID. So what, if anything, is the UK's role in relation to North Korea in the Indo-Pacific?
Great. All very good questions. So do you want to take a first crack at that?
You're speaking to the member for the Labour Party of the North Korea All-Party Group. And yes, we've had a series of events this sort of year in Parliament, one with the ambassador from Japan speaking about regional security, one from we've had the ambassador, as you know, who's based in the UK because he hasn't returned, virtually as a sort of a one-to-one. And then we've got the South Korean ambassador bringing ministerial people to our final session in the summer. So we've managed to have 3 sort of decent meetings. And the other 2 people who are interested in this group are very much in the House of Lords, and they're very committed to the freedom of religion or belief sort of strand of work in Parliament. So I wouldn't say it's a mainstream activity. However, I do think that it is very important that we keep the security questions and the human rights questions on the agenda. And I know that the European Union has got, various sort of tentacles out there as well, and working with European friends and partners, I think we could be more interested in and doing more. I don't hear ministers talking about it very much when you think of what a huge risk it is. It has been also on the agenda with any dialogue that there has been with the Chinese embassy as well, because obviously very influential. Just on that point, I would also say in terms of the parliamentary aspect, even speaking to people from the Chinese embassy because of the bar on the Chinese ambassador coming into Parliament, even those conversations are not as regular as they once were, or, not meeting MPs as much and so on. So, even for rather large players, there's not as much compared to what I think there should be. And Ben has touched on what my role is, which is to remind our manifesto writers as we go into the summer period where the National Policy Forum is going to meet and talk about priorities, is that even increasing the headcount for the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, that will be a really crucial element of what I put forward. And I think that should also not just have that particular element, but also have the cultural piece. I know that, for example, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has taken a very strong view on the Confucius Institutes, and to actually do something differently from those would mean actually having our own homegrown education. We already have it in some excellent places like Cambridge, Oxford University, but some of our other universities and schools are still relying on a contracted out model, which I think would be better to have our own homegrown. We have lots of Chinese speakers in the UK, and since there are more and more B&O passport holders arriving in the UK as well, and Taiwanese, there's no reason why we couldn't have lots of other people teaching and just do it differently, but do it in our own way and do something really creative and interesting. But I would be very surprised if when you look online, come the night before the general election, to see what did Catherine West say about her bit of the manifesto, because manifestos tend to start this big and end up as a pledge card that big. So I will be putting forward my views, and any help that you can offer, Ben, in writing up my plea, my special pleading would be good. But it would be also really helpful to know exactly what the majority party is going to do as well. I get on very well with Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who's the minister, and Tariq Ahmed, who leads on the other part of my brief. But I think it would be really good to have, it's a very joint up cross-party commitment, and I think we could almost promise the same thing, maybe pushing both of our sides equally.
I'll start on that bit really. In my new world and my new life, I think is, and it's tricky with money. I mean, there are manifesto statements on both parties about sort of investing in research and using that as leveraging that as one of UK's sort of unique selling points, etc., to go forward into it. But it's the money that underpins it, I think, is on some of the life sciences. There's a lot of underpinning actually by private capital that sort of helps it through. Less so in some of the skill sets we've had before, and it's been a theme of this that more research, more understanding would sort of help. So I would foot stamp the need for funding and helping a bit more research on that. It is tough otherwise, and if you rely only, as I've learned in my new world, on private funding, that normally comes with control measures, etc. That doesn't necessarily allow the research to go necessarily where it should go. I say that with my very, very new understanding of this world. On the other bit, the other two questions, I think on the Japan one, I think there is. I would say that actually GCAP is an example really of UK tech capabilities and industries sort of being woven together to try to help that through. I think you're right to talk about the implications on Taiwan, and that's why I raised in my opening comments really that I did notice the language that was not there present before is now there. I don't know what that means in policy terms. I don't think we've decided what that means in policy terms, except we'd like it answered peacefully. We always wanted it answered peacefully. We're now just saying it in our written documents that have the government sort of crown on it before. So, but that is a change, but I don't know what that actually means should something happen. Which goes back slightly to the NATO thing. We don't have a plan, if you know what I mean, of a formed coalition that's decided what to do. I think then, and if I may, it comes down to the Korea bit. And I sort of lightly danced around it a little bit earlier on that this is not Europe. And actually the tension sometimes between people we think are all happy together are not necessarily under the surface as happy together as we would think. And, you know, South Korea and Japan and North Korea would be the sort of classic sort of case study of that to go through. I think there is language in North Korea in the IR refresh, and it's very ambitious language in terms of how we do it. And the path to get to some of that to be honest, is quite tricky to do. How do we play our role at the moment? As you know, there's parts within the UN sort of mission, both in maritime and on the land itself before, but it's diplomatic and demonstrative rather than necessarily sort of effective. But I think, and I studied North Korea when I was on exchange for quite some time, you know, it will, that scenario will come to something different at some point. And when it does, none of the ways through the next step are very, there isn't a simple step that you can see over that bit. And because I don't know when it's going to be, 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, who knows when it's going to be. But the current status, I think, won't stay, and that is a real challenge. And but our part in managing it, like I say, is around the outsides, and there is some sort of special stuff within it, but not that much. But you're right; it was a flaw not to mention that at the beginning.
Great. I'll just say one final thing by way of comment, which is that I agree absolutely with the need to prioritize language teaching and language training, but I would also say not only for Chinese, right? That this is something that not only Chinese, not only Japanese, but also, for example, Indonesian and Thai and Vietnamese and lots of other languages from the region that are really very seldom taught. And in fact, what we've seen in recent years is cutbacks in some of those, at places like SOAS even, which had been a real sort of national treasure for teaching of those languages. And not only language, but also history and what we used to refer to as area studies, and integration of that into social science research and education more broadly is really the only way to make sure that there is going to be the kind of focus, and not just focus, but understanding and sort of depth of insight into how to deal with this incredibly large and complex part of the world that we've been focused on today. So with that, let me thank both Catherine West and Doug Chalmers for joining us and for all of their comments. Thank you, everyone who's come and participated and been here today. We have drinks downstairs ready, I think, at this point for everyone. So I invite everyone to come downstairs, have a drink, enjoy the beautiful day, and thank you again. Thank you so much.